Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. Tonight's story takes place in London. It is 4 in the morning. The streets are empty, and beneath the cobblestones, the notebook had been in the drawer of William's writing desk for 4 years before Frances opened it. She had known it was there. She had placed it there herself on the evening of the day he died, on the 3rd of March, 1879, carrying it from his study to the bedroom she had made into her own writing room, placing it in the deep bottom drawer with the finality of something she was not ready to look at and was not certain she would ever be ready to look at. And then the years had passed, as years do, with the particular quality of time that accumulates around grief, not emptying it, but covering it, the way silt covers a riverbed, slowly and without drama, until what was once impassable becomes merely something one moves carefully through. She opened it on the 3rd of March, 1883, which was the 4th anniversary of his death, and a date she had marked in previous years by going to the churchyard and standing for a time in the manner of someone who has said everything that can be said and is simply present. This year she had gone to the churchyard, and then she had come home, and she had opened the drawer, and she had taken out the notebook. William had been a cartographer, not the grand kind, not the kind whose name appeared on published maps of imperial territories. Those cartographers existed in other offices, with larger salaries and institutional authority. William had been the working kind, the kind employed by the Metropolitan Board of Works to survey what was underground, to note the positions of old tunnels and buried streams, and the ancient drainage works that Bazalgette's great new sewers incorporated and extended, and in some cases simply overwhelmed. He had spent 9 years descending into manholes and walking the tunnel routes and measuring, with the careful precision of a man who understood that a map was only useful when it was accurate, the courses of London's hidden water. The notebook was the private record of the part of his work that the Metropolitan Board had not commissioned. The board wanted engineering measurements, depths and gradients and junction points. William had wanted something else. He had wanted to know where the old rivers still spoke, where they could still be heard, where, if one descended into a tunnel in the right place or knelt at the right grating in the right street at the right hour, the water was audible beneath the Victorian city, still moving, still finding its way to the Thames as it had found its way to the Thames before London was London. He had filled 37 pages. At the top of the 38th page, which was blank, he had written in his small engineer's script, "Continued when time allows." He had not had time. She had 4 years of time. She had a dark coat and good boots and a brass lantern that burned the cheap oil that gave the best light. She opened the notebook to the first entry and read in the handwriting she had missed for 4 years the first location, Fleet River. Ray Street, Clerkenwell. Dawn, low traffic. Stand at the grating, third from the coaching inn, north side. You will hear it. She went on the Thursday morning, which was 2 days after opening the notebook, taking the time between for the preparation that a new thing requires. The reading and rereading of William's entry, the finding of the lantern, the oiling of its mechanism, the practice of the route from her house to Ray Street, in her mind at various hours of the previous evening, so that when she rose at 4:30 on the Thursday, the sequence was established, and she did not need to think about it, only to perform it. Clerkenwell, in the last hours of the night, had a quality that the same streets in the day entirely lacked. The tanning works, and the printers, and the clockmakers, and the gin distillers were silent. The barrowmen and the market porters were not yet about. The only sound was the gas lamp's faint hiss and the intermittent sound of hooves on the far side of the hill where the night coach from the city was completing its run. She walked quickly but not urgently, in the manner of a woman who has a purpose and is not performing it, who has done unusual things before and does not find them strange. Ray Street was narrower than Farringdon Road, a left turn off the main road, with the coaching inn at its corner and the grating she was looking for approximately 30 feet along the north pavement. She counted them. 1, 2, 3. She stopped. She did not kneel immediately. She stood for a moment, the lantern at her side, and listened in the general way, listening to the street itself, to confirm that the conditions William had specified were met. Dawn, low traffic, no nearby machinery. They were met. She set the lantern on the pavement. She knelt with the careful ease of a woman who has learned to manage her coat on rough cobblestones, and she put her ear close to the grating. She heard it. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a sound that London made in this specific place, at this specific hour, at this specific depth beneath the pavement. A low, continuous rushing, the sound of water moving through a space it had been moving through for centuries. The sound of the Fleet River doing what the Fleet River had always done, which was to flow from Hampstead south toward the Thames, indifferent to everything the city had done above it and around it and over it in the past 200 years. She knelt there for several minutes. She breathed. She listened. She thought William was here. He heard this. He wrote it down so that someone else could hear it. She took out the notebook and wrote beneath his entry, in her own hand, confirmed. March 6th, 1883. 5:14 a.m. Clearly audible. Lower register than expected. More like the note of a cello than of running water. Present throughout my time here. I stayed 7 minutes. She had known, opening the notebook, that she would add to it. This was not a decision she had made consciously. It was simply what the notebook required, what its structure demanded. William had left the entries incomplete. He had noted the locations and the conditions and his first observations, but he had not returned to most of them, had not confirmed them across different seasons and different times of day, had not mapped the variation that living things always showed when observed repeatedly rather than once. The notebook was a beginning. She would make it a completion. She spread it open on the writing desk the morning after Ray Street and looked at the two inks side by side. His faded brown, hers darker and fresher, the two handwritings different but legible, the two accounts of the same underground water separated by 4 years and a lane's length of cobblestone, and the fact of his death. She had thought, coming home on the Thursday morning, that this might feel painful, the juxtaposition of his words and hers, the continuation of his incomplete work in her different hand. It did not feel painful. It felt like the most natural thing she had done in 4 years. She turned to the second entry, Fleet River, Charterhouse Street, at the junction with Farringdon Road, the grating in the centre of the road. Note, best heard in winter when the river runs high, confirm in March. She wrote beside it, to be confirmed, added to Thursday route. Then she turned to the entry she had been avoiding, not from reluctance, but from a kind of reverence, as one saves the best page for last. It was the entry in the middle of the notebook, the one William had written differently from all the others. Not a technical description of location and conditions, but a longer passage, more speculative, in a slightly looser version of his usual precise hand, the hand of someone writing at the end of an evening rather than in the field. She read it for the 3rd time since opening the notebook. He had written, "I have been thinking about why these churches are where they are. St. Bride's, at the bottom of Fleet Street, built on the Fleet's west bank. St. Andrew, Holborn, on the Fleet's eastern slope. St. Mary Woolnoth, on the old course of the Walbrook. The Temple Church, on the Fleet's floodplain. These are among the oldest religious foundations in London. I believe they are where they are, because the people who built them could hear the water beneath. They heard it and thought it sacred. They built where the sound was. The water has been underground for centuries. The churches are still there. Is the sound still there?" She had written beneath this, on Thursday morning, in a hand that was slightly less careful than her usual. Yes, by the 2nd week of March, she had established her route. This was itself the work of several days. The cross-referencing of William's entries with the old maps she found in his study. The comparison of those maps with the current street plan of London. The identification of which locations were still accessible in 1883 and which had been built over or altered beyond recognition since he had made his notes. Most were still accessible. The city's surface changed faster than the city's underground, and the gratings that covered the ancient drainage channels were, by the nature of their purpose, maintained in perpetuity. The route was this: Ray Street, Clerkenwell, for the Fleet; Charterhouse Street, for the Fleet again; louder here; Farringdon Road, where the Fleet ran closest to the surface and was audible at 2 separate gratings; St. Bride's Churchyard, where William's most arresting note. The water was audible not at a grating, but through the foundations of the church itself, a low resonance in the old stone that was not an echo of the street above, but was something that came from below. The Walbrook, accessible at 3 points in the city, all near the old Walbrook Street. And then, on the longer Thursday routes, the Westbourne at Sloane Square, where the iron pipe that carried the river through the station was visible to any person on the platform, and audible if they knew to listen, and the Effra at Kennington, where a section of the river ran through a Victorian culvert beneath the road and could be heard at a particular spot on the pavement, loudest after rain. 6 rivers. Some had multiple listening points. She numbered them in order of distance from her house and walked them in the same sequence every time, so that the variation she was measuring was the rivers variation, and not the variation of the root. She had, in William's study, found a good compass and a pocket watch. She had always been good at numbers. William had said this, sometimes with admiration, and sometimes with a slightly wounded expression that she had loved because it was so honest, that she was better at the practical arithmetic of observation than he was. She used them now. Her neighbour, Mrs. Alderton, who occupied the parlour floor of the house at the other side of the party wall, and who had been Francis's most consistent practical support through the years since William's death, in the form of shared suppers and borrowed coal, and the particular companionship of a woman who did not ask unnecessary questions and did not provide unnecessary comfort, knocked at the door on the Friday evening of the second listening week and found Francis at the writing desk with the map spread out and the notebook open, and her coat on the chair, still wearing the damp from the morning's walk. "You've been going out early," Mrs. Alderton said. This was not a question. Mrs. Alderton's front room window faced east toward the street, and she was a woman of regular habits who rose at 5:30, and Francis had been rising at 4:30 and leaving the house in the dark, and Mrs. Alderton's front window did not miss things. Before dawn, Francis confirmed. Somewhere specific. Francis considered how to explain this. Over 4 years, she had refined the skill of explaining William's unusual professional interests to people who did not share them, and she applied the same skill now to her own unusual continuation of those interests. "William left an unfinished notebook," she said. "Records of places in London where you can hear the old rivers, the Fleet, the Walbrook, the others that were buried when the sewers were built. He never finished verifying the entries. I'm doing that." Mrs. Alderton looked at the map with its neat crosses. "You're going out before dawn," she said slowly, "to kneel in the street and listen to rivers." "Yes." A pause. "And you can hear them?" "Yes." Mrs. Alderton regarded this for a moment. She was a woman who had been a schoolmaster's wife for 30 years and had accordingly developed the ability to assess unusual proposals on their merits rather than their appearance. "Is it safe?" she said. "At that hour?" "I know these streets," Francis said. "I have lived here 26 years. "Then," said Mrs. Alderton, "would you show me the Fleet?" Mrs. Alderton came on the following Thursday, which required her to rise at 4:15 and put on her substantial wool coat and her waterproof boots, and meet Francis at the street door at 4:20. And she did all of these things with the pragmatic willingness of a woman who had been invited to something and intended to arrive prepared. They walked to Ray Street in the last of the dark. Francis carried the lantern. Mrs. Alderton carried a small folding stool she had brought on her own initiative, which was entirely sensible given her knee, and which Francis noted for her own future use. At the grating, Francis demonstrated the lantern placed, the kneeling, the position of the ear. Then she stood back. Mrs. Alderton settled herself on the folding stool, which worked better than kneeling, and was, Francis decided, a definite improvement to the method. She watched Mrs. Alderton's face. It took perhaps 30 seconds. Then Mrs. Alderton's expression changed. Not dramatically, because Mrs. Alderton was not a dramatic woman, but with the particular quality of a face in which something has just been confirmed that one was not certain would be confirmed. She stayed at the grating for approximately 3 minutes. Then she straightened up and looked at Francis. "That's a river," she said. "Yes. Down there. Down there. About 20 feet. The Fleet." Mrs. Alderton looked at the pavement. She looked at Ray Street around them, the cobblestones, the coaching inn dark at its corner, the gas lamp at the junction. She looked at the grating. "It's been there all this time," she said. "All the years I've walked this street." "It was there when the street was built," Francis said. "It was there before the street." They stood together in the last of the London dark. The Fleet ran beneath them. The city would wake in an hour, and the sound would be lost under everything else. But now, at 28 minutes past 5 on a Thursday morning in March, two women were standing above a river that no one else in London was thinking about, and the river did not know it was being heard and did not care. And this was, Francis thought, exactly as it should be. William had belonged to the Association of Metropolitan Surveyors, a small professional body, 60-odd members at the time of his death, who met quarterly at rooms in Holborn to exchange findings about London's underground infrastructure. Francis had attended the dinner held in William's memory in March of 1879 and had not returned since, partly because the association's membership was entirely male and her presence at non-memorial occasions required a justification she had not felt she possessed, and partly because grief, in its early years, makes the rooms where the dead person's colleagues gather into rooms that are actively difficult to be in. She wrote to the association's secretary in the second week of March, 1883, with the formality that the situation required. She explained that she had found William's private research notebook, that it contained observations about the audibility of buried rivers at specific London locations, and that she intended to complete his verification work. She asked whether the association would be interested in the results. The secretary, a man named Croft, whom William had liked and described as the most practically useful person in the organization, wrote back within the week. His letter was correct and somewhat careful, the carefulness of a professional man responding to a widow's unexpected communication. But its substance was unambiguous. Yes, the association would be interested. William's unofficial research had been known to several members. It had been considered preliminary, incomplete. If Francis was prepared to complete it, the association would receive the results with thanks and would consider publication in their proceedings. She wrote his reply in the margin of her copy of his letter. "Publication is not the point. The point is to finish what he started." Then she considered. Then she crossed out the margin note and wrote to Croft, "Thank you. I will send the completed notebook when the verification is finished. I estimate the work will take 1 year." The entry for St. Bride's Fleet Street was the one in William's notebook that read most differently from all the others. It was the entry that had made her certain she would complete the work, and it was the entry she had saved for the 4th Thursday of March, which was the morning she had chosen for it, in the way that one chooses the right time for the thing that matters most. She reached the churchyard at 17 minutes past 5. The Church of St. Bride's, the Printer's Church, the one Wren had rebuilt after the Great Fire with the tiered spire that was said to have inspired the first wedding cake, the one that stood at the foot of Fleet Street, where Fleet Street met the descending ground toward the old Fleet Valley, was dark and closed at this hour, but the churchyard gate on the south side was unlocked, as it always was, and she went through it into the small walled garden that was the churchyard proper. A handful of table tombs and the flat slabs, a few old plane trees, the church wall on the north side rising to the steeple against the March sky. She did not go to a grating. William's instruction for St. Bride's was different. Stand at the church's north wall, between the second and third windows. Put your hand on the stone. Do not listen for sound. Listen for something else. I cannot better describe it than this. The stone knows. She stood at the north wall. She put her hand flat on the old stone. What she felt was not exactly a vibration. It was something more fundamental than that, a kind of aliveness in the stone, a barely perceptible quality of movement that was not the stone moving, but was something beneath the stone moving and the stone transmitting it, in the way that a very still room transmits the conversation in the room adjacent, not clearly, not identifiably, but unmistakably present. She stood there for a long time. The city around the churchyard was still quiet. The first delivery carts would come at 6, the print shop workers at 7, the street cleaners already working in the distance, but not yet in this street. She stood with her hand on the stone, and the fleet beneath her, and the city above her, and the pre-dawn London sky turning from black to deep blue overhead. And she thought about all the people who had stood in this churchyard over the centuries, Romans, Saxons, Normans, the medieval Londoners for whom this had been a riverbank, and whether any of them had put their hand on the stone and felt what she was feeling, and whether they had known what it was. William had written at the end of the St. Bride's entry, "They built here because the water was sacred." I think they were right, though not for the reason they thought. She had begun carrying William's compass on the listening walks, not for navigation. She knew the streets of Clerkenwell as well as she knew her own house, and the streets of the city almost as well. But for the bearing records that William had kept with each entry, which she had at first thought were technical in the engineering sense, and had gradually come to understand was something else. He had been recording the direction in which each river ran at each listening point, building up a directional picture of the underground water's flow, the way that a person tracing an invisible line through a landscape notes the angles between landmarks so that someone following the notes can find the line again. His compass was a naval pocket compass, inherited from a seafaring uncle, brass-cased, with a ring for a watch chain on its hinge, and the cardinal points marked in a clean, old-fashioned script on the ivory dial. She kept it in the deep pocket of her coat, where it lay comfortably against her hand, and she took it out at each listening point and noted the bearing of the river's sound, the direction from which the sound came strongest through the grating, which corresponded, when you understood what you were doing, to the direction of the river's flow toward you from its upstream source. She had been doing this for 2 weeks when she realized that the compass bearings, taken all together, mapped the rivers. She sat down with William's entries and her own additions and a sheet of cartridge paper, and she drew it, each listening point as a dot, each bearing as a line through the dot. The lines, assembled, sketched the courses of the rivers with a fidelity that was not precise, but was unmistakable. the fleet running south from Clerkenwell toward the Thames, the Walbrook running southwest through the Old City, the Westbourne angling southeast from Sloane Square toward the Thames at Chelsea, the river's paths traced from the surface by sound. She wrote in the notebook on a new page after William's last entry. March 22nd. Compass bearings now sufficient to sketch river courses. Map in progress. Fleet, bearing 195 degrees at Ray Street, 190 at Charterhouse Street, 185 at the Fleet Bridge site, consistently south-southwest, consistent with known course to Blackfriars. Method works. On the last evening of March, she sat at the writing desk and wrote the month's summary in the notebook. She had begun doing this in the way she had seen William do it, though he had never explicitly described it. A summary paragraph at the end of each period of work, extracting the conclusions from the accumulation of individual entries, the analytical counterpart to the observational record. She wrote, March 1883, 7 listening sessions. Fleet at Ray Street, confirmed across 3 visits, mornings of March 6th, 13th, 20th. Consistent sound, lower register in cold weather. Fleet at Charterhouse Street, confirmed, louder than Ray Street, higher register. River running shallower here. Fleet at Farringdon Road, grating, confirmed, compass bearing, consistent with Ray Street. St. Bride's Foundation, confirmed, vibration in stone, not grating. Cannot describe better than William's description. Walbrook at 3, city locations. 2 confirmed, 1 inconclusive. Requires revisit. Compass bearing map in progress. She paused. The notebook was now, she calculated, approximately half completed. Half of William's entries verified, with her own additions beside them, and several new entries she had added herself for locations William had not included. The second half of the notebook was the longer journeys. Westbourne at Sloane Square, Effra at Kennington, the Tyburn at Buckingham Palace Road, which was the most speculative entry William had made, and the one she was least certain she would be able to verify. Below the March summary, she wrote, in the smaller hand she used for personal notes, William could hear things I cannot yet hear. The Tyburn entry reads like a man who had learned to listen in a way that I am still learning. But I have the spring and the summer. I will learn. She closed the notebook. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the Clerkenwell evening. The sounds of the street outside, the distant clatter of the last cart, a voice calling, the perpetual background of a city at rest. And somewhere beneath all of it, 20 feet below the cobblestones, the fleet running in its old channel toward the Thames, as it had run since before there was a Clerkenwell to run beneath. The city of London, the square mile, the old Roman town, the financial district that was the engine of the empire, was a different place at 4 in the morning from the place it was at 9. At 9, it was the densest concentration of commercial activity in the world. The banks and counting houses and insurance offices and commodity exchanges that had made London the center of the globe's economy for a century, all operating at full capacity in a square mile of streets that were so saturated with purpose that the buildings themselves seemed to lean into the work. At 4 in the morning, it was a city without people, the night watchmen in their doorways, the occasional police constable, the cats of Cheapside going about their own nocturnal commerce. Nothing else. Frances had found the city's pre-dawn hours on her first Walbrook visit and had noted in the notebook, "The city at 4 a.m. is the best possible place to listen. No traffic, almost no pedestrians. The stone streets absorb the silence and return it as something dense and particular. You can hear the old water here." The Walbrook was more difficult than the Fleet. The Fleet ran through Clerkenwell, which was close and familiar. The Walbrook ran through the financial district, which required a longer journey and a different navigational relationship with the streets. William's entries for the Walbrook were also less systematic than his Fleet entries. There were 3 locations, but his confidence in them was variable, his notes containing more qualifications and more listen-for instructions, rather than the direct "you will hear" of the Fleet entries. She went on the first Thursday of April, taking the early omnibus from the Angel as far as Bank, arriving at the Walbrook's first listening point, a grating in Walbrook, near the old church of St. Stephen Walbrook, at 17 minutes past 4. She heard it immediately. It was quieter than the Fleet. The Walbrook ran deeper under the city, its channel incorporated more completely into the Victorian sewer infrastructure, its sound more muffled by the greater depth of brick and stone above it. But it was there. It was there with the same quality of persistence that the Fleet had, the quality of something that did not know it had been buried and was simply continuing. She had not, on the first visit, gone into the churchyard of St. Stephen Walbrook. She had heard the river from the street grating and noted it and moved to the second location. But the memory of St. Bride's had been with her throughout the Walbrook visit, and on the second Thursday in April, she arrived at Walbrook with the intention of trying what William had described for St. Bride's, the hand on the stone of the church wall. St. Stephen Walbrook was one of Wren's churches, rebuilt after the Great Fire, like most of the city's churches, with the particular quality of Wren's work that combined classical proportions with an English directness, making buildings that were both grand and approachable. Its north wall faced a narrow lane. Against this wall, Frances pressed her hand to the old stone at 4:40 in the morning of the 15th of April. The resonance was different from St. Bride's. At St. Bride's, the sensation had been deep and low, the Fleet's full channel sound transmitted through the old foundations. At St. Stephen, Walbrook, it was lighter, more intermittent. The Walbrook running shallower here, its channel narrower, its contact with the church's foundations less complete. But it was present. The stone was alive in the same way that St. Bride's stone was alive. She wrote in the notebook, "St. Stephen Walbrook, North Wall. Resonance confirmed. Different quality from St. Bride's. Lighter, higher frequency, intermittent. The Walbrook is smaller than the Fleet. The sound is accordingly smaller. But the principle is the same." William's note says, "They built where the sound was. I am beginning to understand this more precisely. Not just that the builders heard the water and thought it sacred, but that the water's sound and the water's aliveness was the thing that made a place feel like the right place for a church. The sound was the sign. They were not wrong." Below this she wrote, "I need to check the other old city churches. How many are on old river courses?" She spent the third week of April making a map. Not the route map she had been building from the compass bearings. That one was coming along well. The river courses taking shape in pencil on the cartridge paper, with the fidelity of accumulated data, but a different map, a map of the old city churches and their relationship to the underground river courses. It required the old records. She had William's collection of early London maps, which was extensive for a practical engineer and which showed the city's watercourses as they had been before the Victorian enclosure. The rivers marked in blue as they ran open through the streets, the churches marked as their usual symbols, the relationship between the two visible to anyone who held the map close enough to compare positions. She transferred the church positions and the river positions to a single clean sheet of cartridge paper. The result was not subtle. The older the church, the more likely it was to be on or adjacent to a river course. Not every old church was on a river, but the proportion was striking. St. Bride's on the Fleet, St. Andrew, Holborn on the Fleet's east bank, St. Stephen Walbrook directly above the Walbrook, St. Mary Woolnorth at the point where a tributary joined the Walbrook, Temple Church at the Fleet's floodplain. She noted after listing them. This cannot be coincidence. These foundations are among the oldest in London. The Romans were first, then the Saxons, then the Normans, each rebuilding on the previous foundation. Each time the river was there. Each time they built above it. They were not building randomly. They were building where the sound was. She thought William had the idea. He did not have the map. Now she had both. The Westbourne was the most theatrical of the listening points, which was not a word Francis would have used, and which she did not use, but which was the word that most accurately described the experience of the Westbourne at Sloane Square. The Westbourne had been enclosed in an iron pipe. Unlike the Fleet and the Walbrook, which ran through the brick sewer system as part of the general infrastructure, the Westbourne crossed the district railway at Sloane Square Station in a large iron pipe that was visible to every person on the westbound platform. It crossed above the tracks, approximately 15 feet above the rail level, an iron cylinder perhaps 4 feet in diameter, running from one wall of the station to the other, clearly carrying something of consequence across the cut that the railway had made through its course. William's entry read, Sloane Square Station, westbound platform, morning train. The pipe is visible. You can hear it from the bench at the west end of the platform. No need to kneel. It sounds like nothing else. She took the early morning district railway on the 4th Thursday of April, arriving at Sloane Square at 5:48 before the morning rush. The platform was almost empty. One porter at the far end, a gentleman with a newspaper on the central bench. She sat on the bench at the west end, as William had instructed, and waited and listened. It sounded like nothing else. The Fleet through the grating was a low rush, a river in a pipe. The Walbrook through the stone was a resonance, a transmitted aliveness. The Westbourne through its iron pipe above the railway platform was something between music and machinery, a continuous, low, complex sound that was clearly water moving, but was also clearly the sound of a specific enclosed form of water in iron, the particular voice of the Westbourne, as shaped by its Victorian confinement. It was the only underground river she had heard that sounded like it knew it was being listened to. She sat for 15 minutes. The porter walked past once, looked at her with the incurious attention of a man who's seen everything on an underground railway platform and found nothing worth remarking upon. She listened. She took her notes. She caught the next train back to Clerkenwell and arrived home at 8 and wrote in the notebook, "The Westbourne is the most vivid. It has a voice. The others have sounds." Mrs. Alderton had been to the Fleet twice more by the end of April, and to the Walbrook once, and on the last Thursday of April she arrived at Francis's door with a notebook of her own, a small black pocketbook of the kind used by shopkeepers for accounts, which she had repurposed for river entries, with the practicality of someone who had decided that if they were going to do a thing, they were going to do it systematically. Frances looked at the notebook with an expression that she was fairly certain did not show the degree to which she was moved by it, and which Mrs. Alderton did not mention, respecting the convention between them that significant things were acknowledged through action rather than comment. "I've been going on my own on Tuesdays," Mrs. Alderton said. "The Fleet at Ray Street mostly, but also the St. Bride's churchyard, the Stone." "You went alone?" "It's perfectly safe at that hour if you're sensible about it. I'm 62, not 12. She opened her black notebook. Her entries were in a smaller, rounder hand than Frances's, with the times noted to the minute and the observations brief. "Clear, intermittent, stronger this week. I think it's louder after rain," she said. "The last 2 Tuesday visits have been after Sunday rain, and the sound is fuller. Is that in William's notes?" Frances checked. It was not. She had noted it herself as an observation, but had not yet verified it systematically. "Not explicitly," she said, "but it would make sense. More rainfall means higher water table, the river running fuller." She paused. "That's a useful observation." "Then I'll keep going Tuesdays," Mrs. Alderton said. "You have Thursday. Between us, we'll have twice the data." Frances thought about William, who had worked alone for 9 years on the underground rivers and had told her about them, but had not, as far as she could recall, ever suggested she accompany him. She thought, if he had suggested it, she would have come. She looked at Mrs. Alderton's black notebook and her Tuesday entries. "Thursday and Tuesday," she said. "Yes." William had written of the Ephra with a different quality from the other river entries, a quality Frances had at first read as vagueness and had come to understand, over the weeks of the other visits, as uncertainty. The Ephra was the most southerly of the rivers, running through the south bank, Brixton, Herne Hill, Kennington, Vauxhall, and it was the river he had visited least, the river he had notes about but had confirmed least thoroughly. His entry for the Kennington location was shorter than the others. Ephra, Kennington Road, approximately 200 yards north of the Oval, left side, south-facing stretch. Late evening better than dawn. The Oval crowd dampens it during the day. Listen for a different quality. The Ephra runs faster here, lighter water. She went on a Tuesday, evening in the second week of May, which was a departure from the dawn schedule, but which the entry required. The Oval cricket ground was visible from Kennington Road, its gates closed at this hour, the red Devon turf inside darkening in the evening light, 200 yards north. Left side. She found the place by the slight dip in the road, which William had noted was characteristic of the old valley, the road sagging where the underground river had, over centuries, made the ground above it slightly less stable than the surrounding clay. The Ephra was there, lighter than the Fleet, as William had said, a higher register, quicker, the sound of a smaller river running over a shallower gradient. It had the quality of something that had been in a hurry once and was still in a hurry now, still running toward the Thames with the urgency of its source on the hills above Brixton, still moving at the pace of the open river it had been before London had enclosed it. She knelt at the grating. She listened for 8 minutes. She wrote in the notebook, Effra confirmed, Kennington Road, different from Fleet, lighter, faster, higher register. The oval is built in a bend of the old Effra course. You can see the curve of the ground from the road. The river made the landscape. The landscape makes the cricket ground. The cricket ground is on the river. 3 senses removed. By the middle of May, the church map had grown to include 14 churches, of which 11 showed a demonstrable relationship to an underground river course. She had added to William's original 5 by working through the published histories of city churches that she had found in William's library, looking for references to flooding, to damp foundations, to the spring or the well that many old church histories mentioned as local features. These references, when cross-referenced with the river map, almost always pointed to a river. She wrote to the Reverend Aldgate, the incumbent of St. Stephen Walbrook, who had written to her after Croft's letter had circulated among the association's affiliated contacts, asking whether he had any records of the church's foundation history, specifically any references to water beneath the foundations. His reply, which came within the week, was generous and specific. Yes, he said, there were references in the 18th century vestry records to the spring beneath the North Aisle, which was noted as a nuisance in wet seasons, requiring the raising of the aisle floor twice in the 1700s. He had assumed it was a drainage problem. Francis wrote back, "It is not a drainage problem. It is the Walbrook. The Walbrook has been beneath your church since the church was built. The church was probably built there because the water was there." The Reverend Aldgate wrote back a 3rd time. His letter was shorter than the previous 2 and had the quality of a man who had been made to think about something he had walked over every day of his working life and had not thought about. "Thank you. I will listen for it tomorrow morning," she thought. He will hear it. The stone will tell him. It has been telling people for 1700 years. She went to Blackfriars on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of May, arriving at the Victoria embankment, at the point where the fleet discharged into the Thames, which was the end of the river she had been following upstream, the place where all the water she had heard in Clerkenwell and at Charterhouse Street and at St. Bride's arrived at the end of its journey. Blackfriars in the early morning had the quality of all Thames-side locations at that hour. The smell of the river, which was salt and mud and old commerce, the particular cold that came off the water even in May, and the sound of the Thames itself, wide, tidal, the largest sound in the city's collection. The fleet's outfall was not glamorous. A culvert mouth under the embankment, visible at low tide as a dark opening in the stonework, from which a thin stream of the fleet's remnant water emerged and was immediately absorbed into the larger brownness of the Thames. She stood at the embankment wall and looked at the outfall. The fleet had been audible all the way from Ray Street. She had followed it in pieces through Clerkenwell and the city and the Blackfriars neighbourhood. confirming each of William's entries and adding several of her own. She had heard it as a single thread of sound running beneath the city's noise from its deep inner origins at Hampstead through its central London course to this point, where it gave itself to the Thames. The Thames was running with the morning tide. The outfall was submerged. At high tide, the fleet's culvert mouth was under water, the river's output swallowed by the greater river without a surface record. Only at low tide was it visible. Only by ear. Only by kneeling at specific gratings in specific streets at specific hours could you trace it at all. She stood at the wall for a long time. She thought, this is what William was doing. Not mapping for the Metropolitan Board, not measuring for Bazalgette, but following the rivers from sound to sound, learning them the way you learn a piece of music, not from the score, but from repeated listening, until you know not just the notes, but the intervals and the silences and the particular quality of each moment in the sequence. Summer changed the listening. She had noted this in May's entries, and it became fully established in June. The city's sound floor rose with the weather, as more people slept with windows open and more street activity extended into the later and earlier hours, and the window in which the underground rivers could be heard above London's surface. Noise narrowed from the long, pre-dawn quiet of winter to a shorter, more precise interval. She adjusted her schedule. Earlier in summer, rising at 4 rather than 4:30, so that she arrived at the listening points in the narrowest quiet of the night. But the rivers themselves were different in summer. This was the observation she had not anticipated and had not found in William's entries. He had made most of his observations in the cooler months, and which she was, therefore, recording for the first time. The underground rivers in summer ran at lower volume, the water table reduced by the summer's reduced rainfall and increased evaporation, the sound at each grating marginally quieter than in March and April. The Walbrook in particular was affected. At one of its listening points in the city, she could barely hear it in June, where in April it had been clear. She wrote, June 4th, Fleet at Ray Street, sound reduced from March peak, but clearly present. Walbrook at Walbrook, reduced, barely audible this morning. Revisit after rain. Mrs. Alderton's rainfall observation now clearly significant. The rivers are seasonal. They respond to the year's water cycle. This should have been obvious. Rivers do not stop being rivers because they are underground. Mrs. Alderton, on her Tuesday visits, was tracking the rainfall correlation with the rigor of someone who had found a variable and intended to measure it. Her black notebook was now half full. She had contributed 2 new listening locations that Francis had not had in William's notes. A point on the Fleet's course at Hatton Garden, where the river was audible through a cellar grating, and a second Walbrook point near the bank of England's north wall. Both confirmed. She had been putting off the Tyburn entry because William's note was the most qualified in the notebook, almost hesitant, which was not like him. The certainty of his other entries replaced by a diffidence that was its own form of information. He had written Tyburn, Victoria Street, near the junction with Buckingham Palace Road. I cannot be precise about the location. The Tyburn runs deep here, incorporated into the palace sewer, deepest of all the buried rivers, furthest from the surface, the most thoroughly entombed. I think I heard it once, on a Sunday morning in February 1876. I cannot promise it is reliable. Try. She tried in July, going on a Sunday morning as William had specified, Sunday being the lowest traffic day of the week, the morning the quietest morning, and arriving at Victoria Street at 5 in the morning with the low expectation of someone trying an uncertain thing. She knelt at the first grating. Nothing, or rather, nothing she could identify above the irreducible background of London at 5 in the morning, which was never truly silent. She moved to the second. Nothing. The third. At the fourth grating, 50 yards further along the street, she heard something. She was not certain. She held her ear at the grating for 4 minutes and heard, intermittently, something that might be the Tyburn, a faint, low, deep sound at the very edge of the audible, coming and going with the small fluctuations in surface traffic present in the moments between one cart and the next, and absent when a cart or a pedestrian passed. She wrote, Tyburn, Victoria Street, fourth grating from the junction, uncertain. Something present, at the edge of hearing. Cannot confirm. William said he heard it once. I believe him. It is there in the same way that very distant music is there. You can hear it when you stop wondering whether you can hear it. I will come back. The Reverend Aldgate's third letter arrived on a Tuesday morning and was waiting on the hall table when Frances returned from the Walbrook visit. She read it, standing in the hallway with her coat still on, which was not her usual practice, but which the letter seemed to require. He had gone to St. Stephen Walbrook on the Monday morning, he said, at 5 o'clock, as she had suggested. He had put his hand on the north wall of his own church. He had stood there for 10 minutes. He had never, in 12 years of ministry at that church, experienced anything comparable to what he felt through the wall. He wrote, I do not know how to describe it accurately in the vocabulary available to me, which is the vocabulary of engineering, inadequate, and the vocabulary of religious experience, perhaps too large. I will try with the vocabulary of ordinary observation. The stone of the north wall of St. Stephen Walbrook is alive in a way that the stones of other walls are not. It has a quality of movement in it, faint and continuous, that I had attributed to traffic vibration on previous occasions when I noticed it. I now understand it is the Walbrook. I understand this with a certainty I cannot explain. The Walbrook runs beneath my church. My church was built above it, for reasons I now suspect were not entirely architectural. I wish to ask you 2 questions. First, are there other churches in the city for which the same is true? Second, would you be willing to show me how to hear them? She wrote back the same evening. The answer to the first question is yes. At least 13 others in my survey. The answer to the second question is yes. I will come to St. Stephen Walbrook on Thursday at 5:15 and meet you at the north door. She wrote in the notebook that evening. Reverend Aldgate heard the Walbrook. He used the word alive. This is accurate. The Reverend Aldgate was a man of 58 who had spent 30 years in the Church of England and who had the practical competence characteristic of Church of England clergymen of that generation, of someone who understood that religious life and domestic life and professional life were not 3 separate categories, but one continuous activity requiring the same qualities: patience, attention, and the ability to be wrong without requiring it to be a catastrophe. He was waiting at the north door of St. Stephen Walbrook at 11 minutes past 5, which told Francis that he was a person who arrived early for things he considered important. He was wearing a heavy coat and looked, in the pre-dawn street, slightly unlike a vicar, more like a man who had got up very early for a reason he had not yet fully explained to himself and was prepared to find the reason worth it. She showed him the position, the specific spot on the north wall, between the second and third windows, as William had written, where the contact with the Walbrook was most reliable. She showed him how to stand, feet slightly apart for stability, both hands flat on the stone, the body relaxed. She stepped back. She watched. He stood at the wall for 8 minutes. His expression in the first 2 minutes was the expression of a man performing an instructed action and waiting for the instructed result. In the 3rd minute, something changed in his face. Not dramatically, because he was not a dramatic man, but with the quality of attention shifting from the performance of listening to the act of hearing. He stayed for 5 more minutes after that. When he turned from the wall, his expression was the expression Francis had seen on Mrs. Alderton's face at the Ray Street grating, and that she recognized now as the specific expression that the underground rivers produced in people who heard them for the first time. Not wonder exactly, but a kind of recalibration, the quiet adjustment of one's understanding of where one is and what is beneath. The vestry records, he said, mention a spring beneath the north aisle. I thought it was a drainage problem. It was the Walbrook. It was the Walbrook, he agreed. He looked at the wall. We have been standing above a river for 1,200 years. Approximately, Francis said. The first Saxon church on this site dates from around 650. The Romans were here before that. She paused. The Walbrook was here before the Romans. By the end of July, the compass-bearing map was complete. She had 34 listening points across 5 rivers, each with its bearing notation and seasonal record, and the lines she had drawn from each point had converged into 5 river courses of sufficient precision to overlay onto William's old maps and produce a combined image that was more complete than anything previously assembled. The buried rivers of London shone not from above, as engineers' theoretical constructions, but from below, as they actually were. Their courses traced from the sound of the water itself, moving through the city they had made, and that had buried them. She spread the combined map on the writing desk and looked at it for a long time. The fleet running south from the hills through Clerkenwell and the city to Blackfriars. The Walbrook winding southwest through the square mile, its curve beneath Cheapside and Cannon Street still following the valley that the Roman city had been built into. The Westbourne cutting southeast through the Park and Chelsea. The Effra angling north from Brixton through Kennington to Vauxhall. The Tyburn threading beneath Mayfair and the Palace Gardens to Pimlico. 5 courses, 20 miles of underground water, still moving, still flowing to the Thames as they had always flowed to the Thames, indifferent to the city above, indifferent to the centuries. And on the map, marked in a different ink, a red she had used precisely because it stood out, the churches. The old churches on the old courses, the buildings placed above the water by people who had heard the sound and had not understood what they were hearing and had been right to build there nonetheless. Something that sounded sacred, something that was alive. She wrote in the notebook, July 31st, map complete. The pattern is clear. I believe William had seen this pattern, but had not completed the verification. The verification is now complete. The churches are on the rivers. The rivers are still there. The two facts together are the discovery. It rained in August, a sustained 4-day rain, the kind that London produced in August when the summer had been dry and the sky finally committed to making the deficit up all at once. The streets ran with water, the gutters were rivers, and in the sewers beneath London, Bazalgette's Victorian brick channels ran fuller than they had run in months, and in the old courses incorporated into those channels, the Fleet and the Walbrook and the others ran at their highest volumes since the spring. Frances went to Ray Street on the morning of the third day. She knelt at the grating in the rain, which required the waterproof cape she kept for exactly these conditions, and held her ear to the iron. The Fleet was louder than she had ever heard it. The same grating, the same river, the same 20 feet of brick and stone between her ear and the water. But after 4 days of rain, the Fleet was running with a fullness that had not been present in the dry summer weeks, a fullness that changed the character of the sound from the steady, low rush she had catalogued across the spring and summer to something more emphatic, more urgent, the river moving faster and with greater volume and communicating this through the grating with a clarity that removed any ambiguity about what it was. She stayed for 12 minutes. She was soaked from the cape upward. She wrote in the notebook, under shelter in a doorway, August 14th, Fleet at Ray Street. Post. Rain maximum. Louder than March peak. The river in flood. 20 feet underground. In Bazalgette's brick culvert, but flooding. It has not forgotten what it was. 4 days of rain, and it remembers immediately. She walked home in the rain. She had never loved the rain more than she did at this moment, which was not an emotional response she could fully account for, but which had something to do with the fact that the rain in the streets above was the same water that was now running louder in the channel below, and the connection between the sky and the underground river was direct and uninterrupted. The water falling on Hampstead Heath, finding its way, as it had always found, its way down through the clay and into the course of the Fleet and south toward the Thames. By September, the summer's crowd was thinning from the streets, and the pre-dawn hours were returning to the deep quiet she had learned to work in through the spring. She walked the route in September with the particular attention of someone checking old friends. The Fleet at Ray Street, still clear. The Fleet at Charterhouse Street, good. The Walbrook, recovering from its summer quietness, back to April volume. The autumn was beginning to bring the rivers back. She was also, by September, beginning to feel the year's approach to its conclusion. The notebook was nearly full. She had filled 30 pages of her own additions, bringing the combined record to 67 pages, from William's 37 to her 67 in 9 months. She had verified all but 2 of his entries and added 23 new ones. The 2 unverified entries were both for the Tyburn, the uncertain Victoria Street point she had heard once and not been able to confirm again, and a second Tyburn location near Buckingham Palace that she had not yet visited. She had been putting the Palace Road location off in the same way she had put the Victoria Street location off, with a vague sense that the Tyburn was the most private of the rivers, the most deeply buried, the one that required the most perfect conditions and the most patient listening, and that it should be saved for the right moment. She was beginning to understand that the right moment would be winter, the deepest quiet, the lowest surface traffic, the night at its longest, and the air at its coldest, which seemed to carry sound differently from the summer air. She wrote, September 20th, planning the Tyburn winter visits. Conditions needed: frost, no wind, no rain, Sunday or holiday, 4 a.m. These conditions will come in November or December. I will wait for them. Croft came from the Association of Metropolitan Surveyors in October, not officially, which was to say, not as a representative of the association with a formal commission, but as a man who had been corresponding with Francis for 7 months and had found the correspondence increasingly interesting and had eventually asked, with the careful formality of Victorian professional courtesy, whether he might call. She showed him the notebook and the map. He was a careful reader, an engineer's reader, which meant he read from the detail outward rather than from the conclusion inward, checking the data before accepting the conclusion it pointed toward. He spent 40 minutes with the notebook and the map, asking occasional questions. What compass? What time of day? Did the sound vary with the season? And she answered each question from the record, pointing to the entry that supported the answer. He looked at the church map for a long time, the 14 churches with their river connections. This is the part he hadn't made, he said. William had the listening data, but not this. I had his listening data and the time to make the map, Francis said. It requires both. Croft was quiet for a moment. The association will want this, he said. The completed notebook and the map for the proceedings. I know. She had always known this was where it was going. When I'm finished. When will you be finished? When I've confirmed the Tyburn at the Palace Road site. That's the last entry. It requires winter conditions. He nodded. He was, she thought, a man who understood the relationship between work and its conditions, who did not try to accelerate things that could not be accelerated. I'll wait, he said. November arrived, with the particular authority of a London November, the shortening of the days to a brevity that reduced the light to a few hours of grey-white midday, the return of the coal smoke to the air, the wet coal that came off the Thames and found its way into every street that ran north-south toward the river. She adjusted her schedule again. By November, dawn came at 7:30, which meant her 5 o'clock departure gave her 2.5 hours of deep night rather than the single hour of winter darkness she had left behind her in the spring. The rivers were loud again. The autumn rains had done their work. The water table was high. The fleet was running at near March volumes. The Walbrook was back to full voice. She went to each of the regular points in the second week of November and confirmed them all. Clear, strong, the sound filling the gratings with a reassurance that was partly meteorological and partly something else, something she had come to associate with the listening itself, the particular comfort of things that are still where they were. Mrs. Alderton had been coming every Tuesday without interruption since April. Her black notebook was now full. She had bought a second. Her rainfall correlation had produced over the summer and autumn, a dataset that showed with clear regularity the relationship between surface rainfall and underground river volume, a consistent 7-day lag between rainfall and peak river sound, which was the time it took for surface water to percolate through the London clay into the river channels below. She had worked this out herself from her own Tuesday data. Frances had confirmed it from her Thursday data. The two independent data sets agreed. "I think we should send this separately," Mrs. Alderton said, showing Frances the rainfall analysis in the second black notebook. "It's not in William's work at all. It's ours." "Yes," Frances said, "it is ours." The conditions she had been waiting for came on the second Sunday of December. Frost on the ground since Friday, the temperature at 2 degrees at midnight, no wind, no rain, the sky clear and black and full of stars, which was unusual for London in December, and which meant the air was clean and still, and would carry sound in the way that cold, still, smoke-free air carried sound, which was further and more precisely than any other kind. She rose at 3:15. She dressed carefully, the wool underlayer she had bought in November for exactly these conditions, the heavy coat, the waterproof boots, the gloves that allowed the fingers to feel the grating's vibration while protecting the hands from the cold. She lit the lantern. She left the house at 4 precisely. Buckingham Palace Road in a December frost at 4 in the morning, empty as it was possible for a London street to be, which was not empty in the way that a country lane was empty, there being always the sense of the city's millions sleeping nearby, but empty of movement, empty of sound, except the frost itself, which in this cold and stillness was audible as a kind of crystalline silence, the sound of everything having stopped. The location William had noted was not a grating in the street, but a position at the edge of the palace garden's outer wall, where a low iron ventilation grill at ground level had been installed when the sewer infrastructure was built. She found it. She had checked the location on 3 previous visits at different hours, establishing its position without attempting the listening, saving the listening for the right conditions. She knelt at the grill. She put her ear as close to the iron as the cold would allow. She waited. For 2 minutes, she heard nothing that she could be certain about. London's irreducible background, the frost silence, her own breathing. Then, in the gap between one cab on the distant road and the next, in the complete stillness of a December night, at 4 in the morning, with the stars above and the frost on the ground and the palace wall beside her, she heard it, the Tyburn, deep, deeper than any of the others, the deepest sound she had encountered in a year of listening, a sound at the very bottom of the register she could reach, coming from further below than the Fleet or the Walbrook or the Effra. But there, the Tyburn, beneath Buckingham Palace, flowing toward the Thames as it had always flowed. She wrote the last entry in the notebook on the morning of the 10th of December, which was the Monday after the Sunday Tyburn confirmation, at the writing desk, with the early morning lamp burning and the notebook open to the final pages. She wrote, December 10th, 1883. Tyburn confirmed. Buckingham Palace Road, outer palace wall, iron ventilation grill. Sunday, December 8th, 4:07 a.m. Conditions: frost, clear sky, no wind, temperature approximately 2 degrees. Sound, present, deep, very deep, deeper than any other listening point in this record. intermittent between traffic and pedestrian sounds, but in complete stillness, clearly audible. The Tyburn runs beneath the palace. The palace is built on the Tyburn's floodplain. This is the last entry in William Ward's notebook, and in its completion. She looked at this for a moment. Then she turned to the inside front cover and wrote on the blank page opposite the page where William had written the title and date of the notebook's beginning. Record of the Underground Rivers of Central London, begun by William Ward, 1870 to 1879. Completed by Francis Ward, March to December 1883. All entries confirmed, all rivers present, all rivers flowing. She closed the notebook. She held it for a moment. The 9 years of William's intermittent fieldwork and the 9 months of her systematic completion, the 2 inks and the 2 hands and the 1 project, finished now in the December morning with the lamp burning and the frost on the Clerkenwell street outside. She thought, he started this because he wanted to know if they were still there. They are still there, all of them. She went to Ray Street on Christmas Eve. It was not a planned visit. She had completed the notebook, had sent a copy of the map to Croft, had written to Mrs. Alderton to say the work was finished, and had expected to feel the particular combination of completion and anticlimax that the end of a large sustained effort generally produced. She had felt the completion. She had not felt the anticlimax. What she felt instead was the desire to go back to the beginning, to go to Ray Street, which was the first entry William had written and the first she had confirmed, and to stand at the grating and listen one more time, not as a recorder, but simply as a person who had spent 9 months learning to hear something and was now, at the end of the year, returning to where she had first heard it. Christmas Eve, in Clerkenwell. 4 in the morning. The frost that December had established settled into the streets with the confidence of a season that intended to stay. The coaching inn at the corner of Ray Street had its lights burning, the night coach from the city finishing its run, the coachman taking his breakfast in the light of the inn window. She walked past him, and he nodded to her with the incurious nod of a man who has seen stranger things in the Clerkenwell night and found her with her lantern and her coat entirely unremarkable. She nodded back. The grating, 3rd from the inn, north side. She knelt. She put her ear to the iron. The Fleet, exactly as it had been in March. The same low rush, the same cello register, the same continuous presence of water finding its way south through the city. It had always been south of. Toward the Thames, it had always reached. December cold, Christmas Eve, Clerkenwell asleep, and 20 feet below, the river doing what the river had always done. She stayed for 15 minutes. She watched the frost on the cobblestones catch her lantern's amber light and return it in small, cold points. She listened to the river until she knew she had heard it completely, and it was time to go home. She thought, 9 months, 67 pages, 5 rivers, 34 listening points. William's notebook complete. The river's still there. She thought, next Christmas Eve I will come back. Croft wrote in January with the association's response to the completed notebook and map. They would include the work in the spring proceedings, he said, under the title, A Survey of the Underground Rivers of Central London, by William Ward and Francis Ward. The 2 names together. She had not requested this. She had sent the work in William's name. thinking of herself as the completer of his project, not the co-author of a survey. But Croft had made the decision, and she found, reading his letter twice at the writing desk on a January morning, that the decision was correct. She wrote back, "Thank you. I have one addition for the proceedings. Mrs. Alderton's rainfall correlation data, which was developed independently of the core survey and represents a significant finding. I will send her data separately for inclusion in an appendix under her own name. This is not my data to submit." Croft's reply came in 3 days. Agreed entirely. Mrs. Alderton's data would be included as an appendix under her name. She showed the letter to Mrs. Alderton on a Tuesday morning, when Mrs. Alderton arrived with her second black notebook and the Tuesday Fleet record. Mrs. Alderton read the relevant passage and folded the letter and handed it back with the expression of someone who has been given something they did not know they needed and have decided to accept with as little ceremony as possible. "Good," she said. Then, "Shall we go to the Fleet?" It was Tuesday. It was January. The Fleet was running at full winter volume. They went. She opened the new notebook on the 3rd of March, which was the first anniversary of the day she had opened William's notebook in the drawer of the writing desk. She placed it beside William's completed notebook, which she had kept, though the association had its copy, and she opened it to the first page. She wrote, 1884, Survey of the Underground Rivers of Central London, Year 2, Francis Ward, Clerkenwell, and below, Mrs. Alderton, Clerkenwell, Tuesday record. She paused. Then she wrote, Fleet River, Ray Street, Clerkenwell. Confirmed every month from March to December 1883. Winter volume highest, summer quietest, spring and autumn optimal conditions. Present throughout. She paused again, the pen in her hand, the new notebook open, the old notebook beside it, the map on the wall behind her with its 5 river courses and its 14 church marks. Through the writing room window, the Clerkenwell morning. March again, the first pale hint of spring in the sky, the trees not yet in bud, but beginning to consider it. She thought, the rivers are still there. They will be there when she comes tomorrow morning and the morning after that, flowing as they have always flowed. The Fleet south through Clerkenwell, the Walbrook southwest through the city, the Westbourne through the park, the Effra through the south bank, the Tyburn under the palace, all of them in their Victorian culverts, all of them running toward the Thames. She put the pen to the new page. She wrote the first entry of the new year, March 3rd, 1884. Fleet at Ray Street, confirmed, still present, still flowing. She had the map printed. Croft had suggested it. The association had arranged it at a printing house on the Strand that did scientific publications, and the result was a large lithographic reproduction of her pencil and ink original, printed in black and red and blue on good paper, with the title at the top, A Survey of the Underground Rivers of Central London, and below the title, both names. She kept one copy for herself and framed it. It hung on the wall of the writing room, above the desk, in the place where a print of some pastoral scene had hung before. 5 river courses in blue, 14 churches in red, 34 listening points marked in black with small numerals corresponding to the survey's entries. The map of what was beneath London, not the streets and buildings that made the city visible, but the water that had made the city possible. She looked at it on the morning after it was hung and thought about all the people who walked above these rivers every day, along Fleet Street and Farringdon Road and the Victoria Embankment and Buckingham Palace Road and through Sloane Square Station, and who had no idea that the streets they were walking had been built above rivers that were still running. The Fleet beneath Fleet Street, the Walbrook beneath Walbrook Street, the names carrying the rivers without the rivers being known. She thought, this is what William wanted, not the survey itself. Surveys went into archives and were read by specialists and cited in technical papers and then sedimented into the general body of knowledge. William had wanted someone to know that the rivers were there, that they were still there, that if you went to the right grating at the right hour, you could hear them. She thought, I know. Mrs. Alderton knows. The Reverend Aldgate now knows. Croft and the Association know. And, through the proceedings, a few hundred more. The rivers did not need to be known. They would flow regardless. But it seemed right that they were. She had noticed, over the year, that each river had its own quality. Not just its volume or its distance from the surface, but something more specific, a character that distinguished it from the others when heard through a grating in the pre-dawn quiet. She had tried to describe this in the notebook entries and had found the description inadequate, the available vocabulary being the vocabulary of music, which was the only vocabulary that came close, but which was not quite right because the rivers were not making music but were simply moving water, which had no intention of producing a sound at all. The Fleet, a cello register, continuous, the sound of a large river moving through a large channel. The Walbrook, quieter, more intermittent, something between a viola and a silence. The Westbourne in its iron pipe, unique, resonant, the water and the pipe collaborating on a sound that was partly water and partly metal. The Ephra, lighter, faster, the sound of a hill stream that had not forgotten it came from the hills. The Tyburn, the deepest, the most elusive, the bass note beneath all the others, heard best in the stillest winter hours. She wrote this description in the spring of the second year, not as a technical entry, but as a personal note in the back of the new notebook, the section she had reserved for observations that did not fit the survey format. She wrote, "The rivers are a choir, each in its own key. The Fleet is the main voice. The Walbrook and the Ephra are the harmonies. The Westbourne is the instrument. The Tyburn is the note beneath all the others, the one you have to stop making noise yourself in order to hear." She read this back and thought it was not precise, but it was as close as she could get with the vocabulary she had, and it was true in the way that imprecise descriptions of precise things were true, approximately in the direction of close enough to be useful. The paper that Mrs. Alderton submitted to the association's proceedings was 2 pages long, which was shorter than any other paper in the proceedings, and was also, Croft told Francis in a private aside at a spring meeting, the most cited paper in the edition when it was published in the summer. It presented, in Mrs. Alderton's characteristically direct prose, the evidence for the 7-day lag between surface rainfall and underground river sound volume, supported by 20 months of twice-weekly observations at Ray Street and the cross-confirming data from Francis's Thursday visits. Mrs. Alderton had not attended the spring meeting. She had been invited and had declined. "I'm not a surveyor," she said. I'm a person who listened to a river on Tuesday mornings. The paper can go by itself. Frances had attended. She had presented the completed survey with the map and the notebook, and the 15 association members present had asked good questions and had not condescended, and Croft had chaired the discussion with the dry competence she had come to value in him. And when it was over, he had said, "The work completes a gap in the survey record that has existed for 20 years. William would have been pleased." She had said, "He was a thorough man. He would have had notes on the presentation." Croft had looked at her with an expression that was for Croft the equivalent of warmth. "No doubt," he said. She walked home from the association meeting through Clerkenwell in the evening light of a spring evening, and the fleet was beneath her as she walked, as it was always beneath her when she walked this route, as it had been beneath every person who had walked this route for 1,000 years, most of whom had not known it was there and had not needed to know. She knew it was there. That was the thing she had, at the end of all of it. She knew it was there. She continued the Thursday morning walks. This was not, in her own understanding of it, a decision she made. It was simply the continuation of something she had established, the way that any sustained practice, once established, tends to continue past the occasion that created it, because the practice itself has become worth continuing. She had started the walks to complete William's notebook. The notebook was complete. The walks continued because the fleet was still there, and she had learned to hear it, and the hour before London woke was still the hour before London woke, and there was no good reason to stop doing at 5 in the morning what she had been doing at 5 in the morning for a year. She had, in the second year, a kind of ease that the first year had not had. In the first year she had been learning the route, learning the sounds, learning to distinguish between the rivers and the sounds that were not rivers, learning to hear what William had heard. In the second year she simply heard it. She went to the grating. She heard the fleet. She noted the conditions and the volume and went on to the next. The listening had become, in the way that long practice things become, a form of knowledge that did not need to be thought about to be operational. It was simply something she did, and in doing it, she knew things that she could not have known otherwise. She knew that it rained on the hills above Clerkenwell 7 days before the fleet ran louder. She knew that the winter fleet was a different river from the summer fleet, though it was the same river. She knew that the sound of underground water through an iron grating at 4 in the morning was the sound of something that had been doing what it was doing since before London was London, and that this was a fact of the same order as the fact that the stars above Buckingham Palace Road on a December night were the same stars that had been above the Thames in Roman times, which was to say, it was a fact that changed nothing and changed everything. The fleet ran. She listened. The city slept. She had thought, over the 2 years, about what the rivers meant. Not in the large sense. She was not given to the large sense, which was William's territory, and which he had handled in his notebook entry about the churches with a speculative quality that she admired but did not wholly share. She thought about what the rivers meant in the practical sense, what it meant to know they were there, what it added to one's understanding of the city one lived in. She had arrived at this. The rivers were the city's oldest fact, older than the Romans, older than the Saxons, older than the churches and the institutions and the financial houses and the printing presses and the palaces. The rivers had been there first and had shaped everything that came after them. The settlements built on their banks, the trade routes that followed their courses, the street patterns that preserved those courses after the rivers were buried, the churches built above the sound of the water, the associations and guilds and businesses that had grown up around the particular activities that the riverbanks supported. London was a river city, not just because of the Thames, but because of the smaller rivers that had threaded through it, and the fact that those smaller rivers were now underground did not change the fact that they were still there, still shaping the ground above them through the subsidence and the damp and the particular way the streets ran, still present to anyone who knew where to put their ear. To know this was not to know something esoteric or arcane. It was to know London more accurately than the person who only knew the streets. The streets were the surface. The rivers were the structure. She wrote, this is what William was doing, not survey work, not engineering verification. He was learning to know the city from the inside out. She went to the Ephra on a Saturday morning in October of the second year, after 2 days of steady autumn rain, which the rainfall correlation predicted would produce peak river sound at the Kennington grating. The walk from Clerkenwell to Kennington was 40 minutes at her usual pace, and she left the house at 4:15 and arrived at Kennington Road at 5 minutes to 5. The Ephra at peak volume was a different experience from the quiet summer Ephra she had confirmed in July of the first year. The rain had done what the correlation predicted. The water table was high. The Ephra was running full in its Victorian culvert, and the sound at the grating was not the edge of hearing whisper she had noted in the summer, but was a clear, continuous, relatively loud rushing that she could have heard from 2 feet away rather than with her ear at the iron. She stayed for 20 minutes. She made the notes. Then, because the morning was dry and the oval was visible from where she stood, and the October sky above it was the particular heavy grey of an October morning that has run with rain and stopped and is deciding what to do next, she walked to the oval and stood outside the gates and looked at the shape of the land. The oval's famous raised embankment, the feature that made it an enclosed cricket ground rather than an open field, was visible from outside the gates as a slight rise in the surrounding terrain. The embankment had been built with the earth excavated when the culvert containing the Ephra was constructed. The Ephra's enclosure had made the oval. The cricket ground existed because of the river beneath it, shaped by the work of burying the river. She thought, everything is like this. Everything is on something that was here first. She went to Buckingham Palace Road on Christmas Eve of the second year. It was not planned. It had been last year. Unplanned, the return to the beginning. And this year it was simply what she did on Christmas Eve now, which was to say it was already a tradition, in the way that the things one does twice with intention become traditions. The 3. In the morning departure, the coat and the lantern and the boots, the 40-minute walk through the Christmas Eve dark, the grating at the outer palace wall. The Tyburn on Christmas Eve was the same as it had been the previous Christmas Eve, which was the same as it had been on the Sunday morning in December when she had first confirmed it, which was the same as it had been when William had heard it on the Sunday morning in February 1876, which was the same as it had been when the palace was built above it, which was the same as it had been when the floodplain the palace occupied was a marsh through which the Tyburn ran open to the sky. She knelt at the grill. The frost was on the ground as it had been last year. The stars were above as they had been last year. The Tyburn was below as it had been last year, and every year before, and every year that would come after. She heard it. She stayed for 20 minutes, which was longer than usual. But it was Christmas Eve, and there was no reason to hurry. The river beneath the palace ran in its deep channel and did not know it was Christmas Eve, did not know it was being listened to, did not know it was the subject of a survey in the Metropolitan Board proceedings, did not know anything except the gradient that pulled it toward the Thames. She thought, William heard this. I heard this. The palace is above it. The city is above it. The river is below, doing what it has always done and will be doing when everything above it has been remade and remade again. She stood. She walked home through the Christmas Eve dark. The city slept. The rivers ran. There were mornings when London's fog was not the coal fog of a windless winter day, but the river fog, the fog that came off the Thames and moved upstream through the streets in the particular slow way of water vapour, finding its level, filling the lower streets first and the higher streets after, so that walking from the embankment toward Clerkenwell in a river fog was walking upward through a dissolving white and then into a clearer air above the fog line that was itself an unusual and private London. She encountered the river fog on a Thursday morning in February of the second year, setting out at 4:30 from Clerkenwell and finding, by the time she reached the Fleet's first grating, that the fog had preceded her and was so dense at street level that her lantern produced a sphere of amber white that illuminated approximately 3 feet in every direction and nothing beyond. She knelt at Ray Street in the fog. The grating was invisible until her hand found it. She put her ear down. The Fleet in fog was the loudest she had ever heard it. This was not, she understood immediately, because the river was running higher than usual. She had checked the rainfall record, and the rain had been normal this week. It was because the fog absorbed the street's ambient sound so completely that what remained was only what came from below. The city above had been silenced by the water in the air. The city below was unaffected, and in the space between, the Fleet was the only thing she could hear. She stayed for 20 minutes. The fog thickened, and then, as she was about to leave, shifted, not lifting, but moving, a slow circulation in the still air. She could hear, from the direction of Farringdon Road, the sound of a night cart beginning its rounds. The fog carried this sound towards her with unusual clarity, and then carried it away, and the Fleet was the only sound again. She wrote in the notebook, February 14th, fog, Fleet at Ray Street, louder than any previous visit, not more water, but less surface noise. The fog silences the city, and the river speaks into the silence. There is a lesson here about the conditions for hearing things. She had been thinking, in the second year, about what William had known that she had not known when she began. Not the technical knowledge, the compass bearings, the grating locations, the seasonal patterns, but the quality of knowing that had produced the entry about the churches, the speculative note that was unlike all his other entries and that she had returned to repeatedly since March. He had written, "I believe they built where the sound was." She had confirmed this with the map, and the Reverend Aldgate had confirmed it through his vestry records and his own experience at the wall. But what had William thought it meant? Why had he been thinking about it? She found the answer in his other notebooks, the professional notebooks from his work with the Metropolitan Board, which she had kept in the study and not opened. On the last pages of the 1876 notebook, after the final technical entries, he had written, in a handwriting slightly different from his usual, the handwriting of late evenings, when precision relaxed into something looser and more tentative. Why does this matter to me? The rivers are buried. The engineering is done. Bazalgette's system works. The city is healthier. This is the correct result. And yet I cannot let go of the question of what was lost when the rivers went underground. Not the sanitation. That was a gain, not a loss. But something else. The people who built above the rivers were not wrong to build there. They heard something, and it oriented them. Now the rivers are underground, and no one can hear them, and the orientation is gone. The city has no idea it is built on water. She read this several times. She thought about her months of pre-dawn listening, the 34 gratings, the 2 notebooks, the map on the wall. She thought, this is what I have been doing, not completing a survey, restoring the orientation. She wrote beside William's 1876 note, in the margin of his professional notebook, "I heard them. They are still there. The orientation is not entirely gone." There was a schoolmaster at the boys' school, 2 streets from her house, a man named Ferris, who taught geography and natural history, and who had read the association proceedings when Croft sent a copy to the local library, and who knocked at her door on a Saturday morning in the spring of the 2nd year with the determined look of a person who has been building up to a knock for several weeks. He was not from the Beekeeping Association or the surveyors or any professional body. He was a schoolmaster who taught 12-year-olds the geography of London, and he wanted to know if he could bring his class to Ray Street. She thought about this. She thought about 12-year-olds at 5 in the morning, and about the Fleet Sound, and about what 12-year-olds thought London was, and what they would think it was if they heard a river running 20 feet below its oldest street. "Not at 5 in the morning," she said. "The sound is best at that hour, but it is also present in the early evening in winter, after the traffic has thinned. Bring them at 7 in the evening in December." He brought 8 boys in December on a Wednesday evening, and she met them at the Coaching Inn corner and walked them to the grating and explained, in the straightforward way she had learned from explaining it to Mrs. Alderton and the Reverend Aldgate, what was beneath them and how old it was and why it was audible. She handed each boy the folding stool. She had bought 3 more since Mrs. Alderton had introduced the method, and each boy took a turn at the grating. The reactions were consistent. Confusion first, then concentration, then the particular expression she recognized in their 12-year-old versions as the recalibration of where one is. One boy, small, dark-haired, methodical in his approach to the stool and the grating, looked up after his time and said, "It's been there the whole time I've been alive." "Yes," Francis said. "Longer than that." The boy nodded, considering this. "Can I come back?" he said. It was Will Tanner's question in its way from the scene at the beekeeper's gate, the question that a young person asks when they have found something worth returning to. "Yes," she said. "Come in March." She had never gone at midnight. The listening sessions were at dawn, the deep pre-dawn quiet, the city between the night's commerce and the morning's beginning, the hour William had specified and she had confirmed across every season. But in the second year, in April, she went once at midnight to hear what midnight was. The streets were not as quiet as at 4 in the morning. There was still traffic, the night cabs, the late pedestrians, the occasional delivery cart. But it had a different quality from the morning traffic, which was purposeful and directional. The midnight traffic moved with a looser quality, the quality of people on their way from somewhere rather than to somewhere. And the sound of it was irregular rather than the steady building that preceded the morning rush. She went to the street called Walbrook. She knelt at the Walbrook's grating at 11 minutes past midnight. The Walbrook at midnight was not the same as the Walbrook at 5 in the morning. It was there. She could hear it, the same quieter, intermittent sound she had confirmed a dozen times in the daylight hours. But it was partially covered by the midnight street noise, requiring more concentration to isolate from the irregular passing sounds above. She listened for 10 minutes, working through the intervals between cabs and pedestrians to catch the river in the silences. She thought, "This is what it is like to hear something that is always there, but not always audible. The river has not changed. The conditions around it have changed. The art is to find the silences." She wrote in the notebook, "April midnight, Walbrook. Present, audible in silences between traffic. Different experience from dawn. Requires more active finding, less passive receiving. The river does not change its sound. The listener must change their listening. Dawn is not the only time, but it is the easiest time." In the autumn of the second year, a letter came from a woman in Manchester, addressed "Care of the Association," having seen the proceedings. Her name was Mrs. Ellen Cross. She wrote that she lived near the River Medlock, which ran through Manchester and which had, in the 1870s, been substantially enclosed in culverts as part of Manchester's own sanitary improvements. She had read Francis's survey with the particular attention of someone encountering information that explains something they have been noticing without explanation. She wrote, "I have been hearing something beneath the streets near my house for several years and have been unable to account for it. I attributed it first to the drains and then to some machinery I could not identify. Having read your survey, I believe I have been hearing the Medlock. I have today placed my ear against the grating in the street outside my front door and heard it clearly. It sounds exactly as you described the fleet, a low, continuous rushing at a frequency lower than surface drainage. I intend to attempt a survey of my own. Would you be willing to correspond about method?" Frances read this letter twice. She wrote back the same evening, in the longest letter she had written since the early months of the survey. Yes, she would correspond. The method was the compass bearings and the seasonal records and the rainfall correlation and the church map, which she described in detail. She enclosed a hand copy of her Ray Street entry as a model for the notation. She wrote in the notebook, October 14th, letter from Mrs. Cross, Manchester. The Medlock. The method transfers. She thought about this. She thought about William in the Clerkenwell tunnels, working alone on a survey that he had not finished and that she had finished, and about Mrs. Alderton on her Tuesday mornings, and the Reverend Aldgate at his church wall, and the schoolboys at the grating, and now Mrs. Cross in Manchester with her ear to the Medlock grating. She thought, there are other rivers in other cities. There are other people who have been hearing things they could not account for. She wrote to Croft, I believe the survey method should be published more widely. There are buried rivers in every English city. There are people who have been hearing them without knowing what they are hearing. Mrs. Alderton's rainfall correlation paper, in the 2 years since its publication in the Association proceedings, had produced correspondence from 3 other beekeepers. No, not beekeepers. 3 other observers of natural phenomena who had independently noticed delayed responses to rainfall in their own systems and had not known how to frame the observation until they had a name for it. A garden keeper in Kew who monitored the water level in a deep well and had noted a consistent 10-day lag. A canal lock keeper in Hertfordshire who monitored the flow rate at his lock. A gamekeeper in Berkshire who had tracked the rising of a spring on the estate. Mrs. Alderton had corresponded with all 3 and had incorporated their data into an extended version of her paper, which Croft was preparing to include in the next year's proceedings. She showed Francis the draft on a Tuesday morning at the end of October, arriving with it under her arm and the second black notebook and the Tuesday Fleet record. It's the same phenomenon in all 4 cases, she said, spreading the draft on Francis's desk. Surface rainfall percolates through the ground and reaches the water table at different rates depending on the soil. But in each case, the rate is consistent within the local geology. It's predictable. It's a law. Francis read the draft. The 4 cases, the Fleet, the well, the canal, the spring, the 4 lag times, 7 days, 10 days, 8 days, 6 days. The variation, accounted for by the soil type at each location, the clay of London being slower than the chalk of Berkshire. You should present this at the spring meeting, Francis said. I don't present things at meetings, Mrs. Alderton said. You should. A pause. Mrs. Alderton looked at the draft paper. She looked at the rainfall table at the end of it. 2 years of Tuesday morning observations translated into a pattern that was now confirmed by 3 independent sources from 3 other counties. Yes, she said. I should. She opened the 3rd notebook on the 3rd of March, which was the 2nd anniversary of opening William's notebook. She had developed the habit over the 2 years of marking this date by going first to the churchyard, the same churchyard visit she had made before she found the notebook, and then by going to Ray Street. The Fleet at Ray Street on the 3rd of March of the 3rd year, clear, present, the same low cello rush she had first heard on the 6th of March 2 years before, the same grating, the same 20 feet of London clay and Victorian brick between her ear and the water, the same river that had been running through this valley since before there was a Clerkenwell, since before There was a London, since the Ice Age had carved the valley that the fleet had been filling with water ever since. She knelt at the grating in the March morning and listened for 12 minutes, which was the longest she had stayed at Ray Street in 3 years. She was not listening for new information. She knew the fleet's sound at this grating in all its seasonal variations, could have described it accurately without kneeling at all. She was listening because the listening was worth doing. The same reason that people return to the places they loved, not to discover them, but to be in them again. The same reason that any practice worth having was worth continuing. She wrote in the third notebook, on the first page, in the space where she had always written the date and the river and the confirmed March 3rd, 1885. Fleet at Ray Street. 3 years. Still present. Still flowing. She paused. Then she wrote below. William started this because he wanted to know if they were still there. They are still there. They will be there after I am gone, as they were there before I was here. I am in the middle of this, as I have always been in the middle of this, between the sound and the stone, between the water and the city. This is the only place to be. Croft had told her in the spring of the 3rd year that there was a section of the Walbrook's course that passed beneath the Bank of England, not adjacent to it, not near it, but beneath the main building, through the foundations that had been sunk in the 18th century when the bank was rebuilt by Sir John Soane. The old riverbed was known to the bank's engineers. There were records of it in the bank's own archives, which Croft had been given limited access to in connection with the survey. He had given her one piece of information from the archives, the approximate location of the Walbrook's course beneath the building, which passed under the outer wall on the north side, at a point that corresponded to a ventilation grill in the street outside. She went on a Sunday morning in May of the 3rd year, which was the quietest Sunday she had had in years. No wind, no rain, the temperature already warm enough to make the May dawn comfortable rather than cold. The north side of the Bank of England, at 5:15, the great stone facade, the windowless walls, the street entirely empty. She found the grill. She knelt. She listened. The Walbrook beneath the Bank of England was clearer than the Walbrook at any of her other listening points. She did not know why. Perhaps the stone of the bank's foundations transmitted the sound differently. Perhaps the section of the river here ran through a different quality of channel. Perhaps the deep Sunday quiet and the complete absence of other sound was the reason. Whatever the cause, the Walbrook at the Bank of England's north wall was the clearest she had heard it. The sound, fully present, fully identifiable. The river that had run through Roman Londinium, now running beneath the financial institution that had replaced the empire as the engine of British commerce. She stayed for 15 minutes. She wrote, Walbrook, beneath the Bank of England. Clearest confirmation in the survey. The river that the Romans built above, the Saxons built above, the medieval city built above, now flowing beneath the building that handles more money than any other institution in the world. The river does not know. The bank does not know. I know. In October of the 3rd year, she noticed that the plane trees along Farringdon Road had been planted in the same line as the fleet's course. She had walked this road hundreds of times and had never noticed this consciously. But in the autumn, when the leaves were coming down and the tree trunks were visible in their full extent. The alignment was clear. The trees followed the river, their roots in the damper ground above the Fleet's channel. She mentioned this to Mrs. Alderton on a Tuesday morning at the grating, and Mrs. Alderton looked at the trees and said, "They always plant trees where there's water." "Yes," Francis said, "but the water is underground. The trees know anyway." Mrs. Alderton considered this. "The roots go down," she said, 20, 30 feet in old plane trees. They reach the water. Francis wrote in the notebook, "October, plane trees along Farringdon Road, planted above the Fleet. Trees following water underground, roots 20 to 30 feet, reaching the river channel. The trees can hear the Fleet in whatever way roots hear. The trees are in the same relationship to the Fleet as I am, attending to it, being guided by it, following where it goes." She thought, there are other listeners. The trees have been listening since the trees were planted. The roots in the damp ground above the river. The slow listening of things that grow toward water without knowing they are listening. She looked at the plane trees in the October morning, their leaves coming down in the still air, their roots somewhere below in the London clay, reaching toward the Fleet. She thought, we are all in the middle of this. The trees, the churches, Mrs. Alderton and her rainfall tables, William in his tunnels, me at this grating. The river runs, we listen. This is the arrangement. She confirmed the Tyburn a third time on the last Sunday of November, which was the coldest morning of the autumn so far, the temperature at -1 at 4 in the morning, and the pavement at Buckingham Palace Road white with the first hard frost of the season. She had confirmed it first in December of the first year, and once more in January of the second year, and this third confirmation was not strictly necessary for the survey, which had 2 confirmations already. She went because the conditions were perfect, and because the Tyburn was the river she had heard fewest times, once for each year, and because she wanted one more. At the grill at 4:14 in the morning, the frost, the stars, the palace wall. She knelt, she listened. The Tyburn, there, deep, very deep, the note beneath all the others, the bass of the choir. She held her ear to the iron for 18 minutes, longer than any previous Tyburn confirmation, long enough to be entirely certain that what she was hearing was not imagination or street noise, but the Tyburn's own voice, consistent and identifiable, the deep underground note of a river running from Hampstead through the parks and under the palace and toward the Thames at Pimlico. She wrote, November Tyburn, third confirmation, clearest in the series. The cold carries sound differently. Everything is more itself in this cold. The Tyburn at -1 in November is the definitive Tyburn. She stood. She put the notebook in her coat. She walked home through the pre-dawn London cold, the pavement white with frost, her breath visible in the lamplight. The city was sleeping. The rivers were running. She was the only person awake in Clerkenwell who knew that beneath the streets she was walking, 5 rivers were making their way toward the Thames, as they had always made their way toward the Thames, in the dark and the cold, indifferent to everything, faithful to their gradient, moving toward the sea. She continued the walks. There was no reason to stop, and no event that caused a stopping. The rivers continued. She continued. Mrs. Alderton continued her Tuesdays. The Reverend Aldgate, at Christmas of the 3rd year, wrote to say he had been to the north wall of St. Stephen Walbrook every Sunday morning at 5 since the previous March, and that the practice had become the most reliable part of his week. The schoolmaster Ferris brought a new class every December to Ray Street. Mrs. Cross in Manchester had sent her completed Medlock survey and was beginning on the Irk. Francis opened the 4th notebook, green cloth, from the same stationer in the market. The 12th notebook in the drawer of the writing desk, now replaced by its direct continuation, on the 3rd of March of the 4th year. She wrote the date. She wrote the entry. Then she put on her coat and her boots and picked up the lantern and opened the front door of the house on the Clerkenwell Street and walked to Ray Street and knelt at the grating. The fleet was there. It was always there. It had been there when William first heard it, and it had been there for every one of the hundreds of times she had come to this grating since, and it would be there next Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and in the summer when it ran quieter, and in the winter when it ran loud, and on the Christmases when she came to hear it before the city woke, and on the fog mornings when it was the only sound in London. She knelt in the pre-dawn Clerkenwell Street with the lantern beside her and the notebook in her coat pocket, and the 4th year beginning around her. The fleet ran beneath her. The city slept above. The stars on this clear March morning were still visible in the deep blue of the pre-dawn sky above the rooftops. She put her ear to the iron. She listened. The river was there. The river listener of Clerkenwell, London, 1883 to 1884, based on the true history of London's buried rivers. The fleet can still be heard at Ray Street, Clerkenwell. The Westbourne Pipe still crosses Sloane Square Underground Station. The Walbrook flows beneath the city. The Tyburn runs beneath Buckingham Palace. St. Bride's Church stands above the fleet. St. Stephen Walbrook stands above the Walbrook. These rivers are real. They are still flowing. If you stand at the right, grating at the right hour, you can still hear them.